Hello and welcome back to another episode of What Just Happened. I'm Samuel McVicar, and today we're going to be discussing the situation in Iran. So this feels like a rapidly escalating situation. It all seems to have stemmed from protests that kicked off in Iran. President Trump then got involved, threatening intervention. Military assets have been moved into the region. Recently, he said somewhat offhandedly that if the Iranians do not agree to a deal within the next 10 days, quote, bad things will happen. So talks are ongoing. There is a new round scheduled for this week. But to unpack all of this, I am joined today by two analysts this time. Megan Sutcliffe, our principal Middle East and Africa analyst, and Claire Brady, principal North America's analyst. So let's start with Claire and the U.S. side. So as I said, Claire, this kind of started with the protests, and then Trump online was threatening some intervention. Can you just tell us from the American side, what is the chain of events that kind of led to this recent 10-day ultimatum that we've been seeing in the headlines?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you rightly pointed out, the anti-government demonstrations in Iran presented the US with kind of a unique opportunity to, return essentially to the region and get done what its original aim has always been, which is to disarm Iran's nuclear program. And these demonstrations against the government, opened that door for Trump potentially to use what leverage he had against the regime to, as I said, get those initial aims done. Now, since then, there have been a couple rounds of indirect and direct talks between the US and Iran. Earlier in the month, it was in Oman, and just a couple days ago, they were in Geneva. And as you've said, now there's going to be another final or potentially final round of talks in just a couple days. Now, what makes this next round so significant is that through all this time and these, previous rounds, the US has been building up its military assets in the region. And what makes right now so pivotal is that it is, considered to be done and in place, and the US is ready for whatever it wants to do now. There's two aircraft carrier groups nearby. There's dozens of fighter jets, bombers, refueling aircraft. It's the largest military force the US has concentrated in the Middle East since it prepared for the invasion of Iraq 23 years ago, just to put it into perspective. So with all that being said, a couple days ago was the inaugural meeting of the Board of Peace, which is a peacekeeping body focused on rebuilding efforts in Gaza. But of course, given the members that were there, Iran was very top of mind at this meeting. And as you pointed out, Trump suggested that talks with Iran will continue, and that we would likely see a decision on if he, conducts an airstrike or not within the next 10 days. And then he went on to say again, pretty offhandedly, there's a 10 to 15 day maximum for Iran. But we also know at that meeting that the US's Gulf allies were really trying to push the president to step away from military action. So that's kind of what has led us all to this moment. And like I said, the reason this 10-day deadline is, quite concerning is because, from a military standpoint, the US is ready to do that.
Thanks, Claire. So how much would you say this is about the Iranian nuclear program, and how much of it is about internal domestic politics in the US?
Yeah, I think it can't be denied that whatever, president achieves, this grand victory of disarming Iran and maybe achieving regime change or something of that sort, would be a huge, huge win. It's a legacy builder. It's, something that, has obviously never been achieved. So from that standpoint, it would be a win like no other for Trump. However, this, in the short term, there are very few political gains to be made in the US from taking action in Iran right now. Americans are very much more concerned about, immigration enforcement operations, affordability concerns from tariffs. We saw the operation in Venezuela, though it was very quick and successful. It didn't really boost Trump's popularity in the polls much at all, or give him, any type of victory that he may have wanted to see as we start to head into the midterm campaign cycle. Um, so, like I said, there is this long-term gain maybe to be made for Trump's legacy, and the Republican Party's just historical, foreign policy stance and wins in that sense. But in the shorter term, there isn't really a lot to be gained. So yeah, Trump is really towing this line of where he could get a big win, but also, the U.S. public will not take it well if the U.S. becomes embroiled in the Middle East, once again.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely not something he ran on, as we've all heard. Um,
Mm.
so I'm reminded of last summer. I think it was June. Uh, Trump, the Trump administration struck some Iranian nuclear facilities. We recorded a bunch of podcasts about it. Why are we coming back to this now? Would you say why now for escalation?
Yeah, I think like I said at the beginning, the anti-government demonstrations kind of presented this very unique opportunity in which the US, maybe alongside Israel, could do some limited engagement in Iran, and something could potentially lead into regime change, without the US having to, completely do it on its own. There was sort of an internal process taking place. And I think the US really saw these demonstrations as exactly that, an opportunity to return to the aims it had last summer. There's also a question of maybe the strikes of last summer weren't as, successful as maybe they were touted to be. There's definitely been a lot of questions raised domestically in the US of, okay, if these strikes we conducted last summer, supposedly put Iran back by decades, why are we now saying in this moment that, they're on the doorstep of having a weapon again? Um, so there's kind of those two questions, but I think really the end of it, the end all be all of it is that this was just trying to capitalize on what was already happening internally in Iran.
Yeah, understood. So this is kind of a tough question, but how seriously should we take Trump's rhetoric at this stage? This seems to be a pattern that folks have commented on before, with some really tough negotiating via tweet, via public address, and then pushing for a deal. Do you see this escalating any further?
Yeah, it's always an interesting one, but I think a lot of foreign nations have taken the uh, strategy that they should take Trump's words at face value. And a lot of times, what he has threatened, he does end up doing. Of course, there's a lot of times he doesn't as well. Um, but it all plays into the negotiating tactic. And I think why we need to be taking his rhetoric seriously is because he has backed it up with this military force in the region. If he was threatening, strikes and military action, and, there wasn't two aircraft carriers nearby, and, all this weeks long buildup that had taken place, it might not be as credible. But because there is the forces in the region to carry out what he's saying, and that wasn't just, an overnight decision that has been in the works for, like I said, weeks now. It's adding a lot of credibility and leverage to his words. So at this point, I think, the most important party, the Iranians, are taking his words very seriously.
Yeah, for sure. And on the military buildup piece, I read somewhere just about the logistics of having those two strike groups in the region present somewhat of a logistical problem. Like, is it sustainable to have all those assets concentrated in one area?
The short answer is no, it's not at all. Already, that was a strain on the military to get all of those assets into the region. I'm pretty sure one carrier group, was supposed to be docking back home and, getting time off, and instead they got diverted back. But the US has a lot of interests, obviously, all over the world. Particularly in Latin America right now, there's a presence, and it also wants to keep assets in the South China Sea. So it's not sustainable to keep this level of engagement in the Middle East, particularly if, there is, not to say nothing's happening, but if they're not going to make a move, those assets will have to be diverted at some point. So again, that kind of adds to the urgency of all this. Is like, okay, if everything's in place, it does need to happen somewhat soon because those forces can't stay forever.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about an actual strike from the U.S. perspective. What is your desk assuming that would look like?
So we believe that a strike would initially be very targeted and, potentially another way to get Iran to come back to the negotiating table. So this could potentially, look at hitting military assets inside Iran, such as, the IRGC headquarters, or the country's nuclear sites, or where it holds its ballistic missile program. So we do think initially it would be quite limited, and then there would be the chance for Iran to, respond after that. Um, and then it would be at that moment that the Trump administration would kind of reconvene and look at if, a bigger attack is viable or necessary.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claire. We'll come back to you at the end, but for now, let's move to the Iranian perspective. So, Megan, how are these threats being interpreted internally? Does the regime believe Trump will actually strike if a deal is not closed?
Well, Iran is certainly taking the military threats from the United States very seriously, and this has been made very clear in state-linked media within Iran. Essentially, Iran's narrative at this point in time is that it will treat respect with respect and it will treat hostility with hostility. And this speaks to the discomfort that's being felt in Tehran amid the mounting military pressure from the United States. Essentially, right now, the perspective of Iran's regime is that they don't necessarily believe that Trump is going to strike imminently, but they do not trust him not to in the event that a deal is not reached and that that deal is not on his explicit terms. Tehran has learned that Trump has a relatively complex stance when it comes to nuclear negotiations and to nuclear agreements. Indeed, it was the Trump administration that pulled out of the JCPOA during Trump's first term. And so even in the event that there was an agreement between Tehran and Washington, D.C. in the short term, there's not a lot of confidence in Trump's reliability as a negotiating partner, or indeed that he would stick to any agreement were it reached.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. And it's great you brought up the JCPOA. I want to ask you both about the JCPOA at the end. But for now, same question to you as I asked Claire, Megan. How do those strikes we saw last summer shape Iran's calculations here?
They certainly inform Tehran's perception of Trump and his willingness to engage in direct action targeting Iran itself. This was something that Iran did learn in Trump's first term when we saw the killing of the IRGC Al-Quds Force chief Qasem Soleimani in a US drone strike in Iraq in 2020. But the fact that Trump was willing to order direct strikes targeting Iranian nuclear facilities shows Tehran that Trump is willing to directly engage, even though he campaigned on a platform of withdrawing the US from so-called forever wars, particularly in the Middle East. Essentially, what it shows is that he is ready, willing, and able to engage in direct military action. And when we pair that with the military buildup that we've seen in the region in the past few weeks, Tehran is certainly perceiving the pressure that is being put on it and is responding to it through negotiating channels.
Yeah, it's interesting. And quick plug, folks listening, Megan did an awesome Power Players episode on our other channel. Links are in the show notes below. Go check that out. Iran is a very sprawling and complicated organization in terms of its government, as you laid out. So I want to ask you about like the hardliners and how this sort of rhetoric, past strikes, threats of renewed intervention, does that I have to assume that strengthens the hardliners within the regime. Is that right?
Yep, absolutely. Often an effect that we'll talk about in any country when there is some manifestation of an external threat is this so-called rally around the flag. And this is particularly acute when we look at hardliners within Iran's regime and security forces. Essentially, since its foundation, the Islamic Republic has attempted to indoctrinate almost all of the population into believing that the United States is the so-called Great Satan. And when we have this much external pressure from the United States, and when we have recent memories of the US engaging in airstrikes targeting Iranian facilities, that provides evidence for that narrative and can go some way towards strengthening hardliners, or at least strengthening their internal resolve. It's also worth noting that, of course, the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is associated with the hardliners camp. That's not surprising at all. But following the anti-government protests that we saw in December and January, we've seen a crackdown targeting reformists within Iran, both in terms of civilians who have faced substantially increased risks of surveillance, harassment, and detention, but also the extension of house arrest for high-profile reformist figures. So, for example, former presidents Mir Hossein Mousavi, but also Mohammad Khatmi, both of whom have reportedly faced increasingly stringent restrictions on their movement and, of course, terms of their house arrest. So, essentially, what we're seeing here is hardliners within Iran attempting to consolidate their support bases, both through narrative threading, through state-linked media, through indoctrination, but also a repression of reformists who would possibly advocate for more lenient negotiating terms, as we saw in the run-up to the signature of the interim agreement that preceded the JCPOA.
Thank you, Megan. So just one more question, and then I want to move on to the nuclear talks with both of you, the ones that are scheduled for this week. But lastly, Megan, is there any appetite for compromise in Iran right now? You've somewhat answered this already, but I did see there have been renewed protests just this past weekend. How are folks feeling about this deal? Are they even thinking about it?
Well, I think it's worth addressing this question in two parts. The first is, of course, the resumption of some protests within Iran. You're absolutely correct. We've seen demonstrations emerging on universities in several cities in Iran, most prominently in Tehran, but also in Mashhad, for example. And this is broadly in line with our forecasting because this comes 40 days after the crackdown on protests in January. And this is broadly in line with the general calendar of Shia mourning. This was something that we saw before the 1979 revolution, which was that every 40 days, essentially, there would be this uptick in protest activity. This is something we can expect to see continuing in the coming days as we come up to those anniversaries for other protesters who were killed during the crackdown in early January. When it comes to appetite for compromise, though, I think it's important to differentiate between the Iranian people and the Iranian government. So whereas it is entirely possible there's a great degree of appetite for compromise, for softening of Iran's terms and lower population, that does not necessarily inform the government's negotiating position. Rather, what we need to look at is the appetite for compromise that exists within the regime itself. And when we're looking at the regime, we need to look at the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, who is not someone who has defined himself by his willingness to compromise. Indeed, Ali Khamenei's approach to negotiations is fundamentally hardline. He sees the process of making concessions as being a fast track towards regime toppling. And so it's unlikely that we're going to see Iran compromising on its fundamental red lines in nuclear negotiations. These relate to, firstly, the continued maintenance of its domestic enrichment program within Iranian borders, and also the narrowing of the scope of negotiations. So only focusing on Iran's nuclear program and prospects for sanction relief, not necessarily engaging in discussions on its missile program or indeed its support for regional proxies.
Yeah, understood. So earlier you brought up the JCPOA, and I think I'll ask this to Claire. Trump, when he came in, he tore up the JCPOA that was created under Obama. I'm kind of wondering what is the Trump administration asking for, and could these talks result in a full circle right back to the original framework of the JCPOA, and then Trump framed that as a win? Is that what it's looking like? What exactly are they asking for?
Yeah, so as I stated before, Trump is looking for a full disarmament of Iran's enrichment program. However, there is some talks that an off-ramp that is being considered is a very limited nuclear enrichment program that Iran could carry out solely for like medical purposes, medical research and treatments. This is not likely to be accepted by Iran, but that kind of gives an indication of where the Trump administration might be willing to bend a little bit, because in that case, Trump could still claim a win. So all that to say, it is a possibility that we do loop back around to an agreement that looks very much like the JCPOA. And, this isn't we've seen this in other areas of Trump's policy as well. For example, what comes to mind immediately is in the trade world. He's threatening to pull out of the US Mexico Canada free trade agreement, and is talking about how unuseful it is when he created that agreement during his first term. So, it's completely within the realm of possibility that, he does switch up. His stance on certain frameworks. But like I said, that shutting down the enrichment program is the number one goal, but there are, certain areas where that could be bent a little bit, but still under the umbrella of Trump claiming that he did get the majority of it shut down.
Yeah, understood. And then to Megan, obviously Iran has already signed in the past a JCPOA deal. So this goes with the kind of positive messaging, as I understand it, that we've seen out of the Iran regime over the past couple of weeks. So is it possible Iran is likely to sign this since they have in the past? Is that correct?
You're absolutely right that there has been a relatively positive framing within Iranian media of the JCPOA and prospects for its essential revival in this new round of negotiations with the United States. Essentially, Iran's core demand is that it will be able to continue enriching uranium within its borders. Iran has reportedly stated that it would be willing to consider proposals for some sort of regional consortium to operate this enrichment program as long as it was within Iran's borders. Now, of course, that would undermine the independence of that particular program, which is not something that necessarily gels with the US's negotiating position, but it is evidence to indicate that we are at least seeing some form of crossover when it comes to the indirect negotiations that are occurring between Iranian and US delegations. That being said, though, it is worth noting that the JCPOA was often criticized by members of the Trump administration, but also of America's more right-leaning community for only dealing with Iran's nuclear program, that it did not touch on its missile program or its support for regional proxies. And of course, the JCPOA was negotiated in a time when Iran's proxy network was comparatively much stronger than it is now. Currently, Iran deals with the fallout from the Israel-Hezbollah war, the Israel-Hamas war, and of course the weakening of the Houthis following campaigns of US and of course Israeli airstrikes in 2024 and 2025. So right now, Iran is in a weaker negotiating position, and there will be pressure on Trump to attempt to leverage that, not only to seek concessions on the nuclear issue, but also on the scope of negotiations in order to moderate some of those criticisms that were trucked out in the early 2010s against the JCPOA. So simply because there has been a relatively positive narrative emerging from Tehran and to a certain extent from Washington, D.C. when it comes to discussing negotiations and the indirect talks. That's not to say that we are destined to rapidly move towards an interim agreement or a permanent agreement between Iran and the United States. Rather, what we've seen so far is engagement, but not necessarily agreement.
Couple more before we wrap up here. I did ask Claire what the U.S. strikes would look like should these talks fail. I want to ask what the Iranian response might look like. So could this, two parts here, could this spill over into a wider regional conflict, bringing in Israel, the Gulf states? Will it use its proxies? What would that look like should this go south?
Well, I think it's important to note that Iran's retaliation to any US airstrike campaign would almost certainly be partially determined by the scope, the intensity, and the effectiveness of that US airstrike campaign. If we're talking about a very isolated drone strike targeting, for example, a nuclear research facility, the type of response that would engender will be extremely different to if we were to see the US engaging in broad airstrikes targeting military and government facilities, for example. So I think it is worth keeping that in mind, that the extent of Iran's response will depend on the extent of US engagement. However, when we're looking at the prospects for regional spillover from any direct engagement from the United States towards Iran, then that is something that is very concerning, particularly for the GCC, for example, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and for the broader region, given Iran's network of proxies. In terms of how Iran will choose to react, well, I think it's fair to assess that there will almost certainly be some form of direct retaliation. We saw precedent being set for this when it comes to interactions between Iran and Israel back in April of 2024, and then again in October of 2024. And then, of course, between Iran and the United States, when we saw Iran engaging in a missile attack targeting the Al Udeid airbase in Qatar back in June, following Operation Midnight Hammer, which targeted Iranian nuclear facilities. So it's almost certain that we would see some form of direct response from Iran. The question is how intense that would be and the extent to which that involved Iran's proxies. Now, over the past few days, we have seen several indicators that would suggest to us that Lebanese Hezbollah, based in Lebanon, is preparing for some kind of engagement when it comes to Iran's retaliation targeting the United States. Most recently, yesterday, we saw the US evacuating non-essential personnel from its embassy in Beirut, and we've seen Israel intensifying its airstrike campaign targeting Lebanese Hezbollah over the past few days. This likely forms part of preemptive efforts to undermine Hezbollah's capacity to engage in hostilities targeting Israel in response to a US airstrike campaign in Iran, while also demonstrating to Hezbollah that Israel is ready, willing, and able to intensify its campaign targeting Hezbollah, particularly in southern Lebanon and in the Bekaa Valley, where Lebanese Hezbollah not only maintains substantial strategic depth, but also stores many of its weapons capabilities. So essentially what that would show us is that the US and Israel are aware of the prospect for proxy engagement when it comes to potential retaliation to airstrikes. Another aspect that indicates that the US is aware of this threat is the deployment of numerous air defense systems and batteries to the region. You've seen increased deployments of THAAD and Patriot missile systems, for example. And that would indicate to us that the US is preparing to adopt a more flexible posture in the region that is able to intervene should it come to direct retaliation from Iran, but also from its proxy network.
Thank you very much, Megan. Okay, one final question for both of you. I'll go to Claire first. Triggers, warnings, and indicators. What will your desk be looking for to signal whether this will fizzle out or get much, much worse?
Yeah, well, I want to emphasize that from the Trump administration's point of view, it is quite a fluid situation and there is no locked in response as of yet. That's why this situation has been so, up and down over the past couple of weeks. And even though there has been such a dramatic military buildup in the region, that does not mean that a diplomatic solution is not still preferred. So with that being said, we will be looking very closely at what happens in this next round of talks. I think Megan put it perfectly when she said there has been engagement, but there has not been agreement yet. And on Thursday, in this next round of talks, there will need to be, some indication that there can be a landing ground between these two parties. If it is still very clear that neither side is crossing their red lines and there is no room for agreement, that will push us into a likely truncated timeline for military action. We're not expecting either side to come out, to the media after these talks and say if it went, poorly or well. But, in the coming days after, there will be, some indications. So that's what we're going to be looking at in the next couple days. I think another thing that was just touched on the U.S. is also watching quite clearly is how much U.S. assets and personnel would be at risk from Iran's proxies in the wider region. If there is all of a sudden, indications that there is a very large threat that might change the US's calculus, or, if they don't think there will be, that will also change things. Um, and one final thing I think on the outside is still, the influence that Israel and the Gulf states have on the US. What Israel is willing to engage in and support is going to very much, influence what the US is willing to do as well. So, that's a dynamic to watch closely as well in the longer term. But like I said, it's really this next round of talks that is going to be, pretty influential.
Thank you very much, Claire. So Megan, same question. I imagine you are also watching these talks very closely. Any other triggers, warnings, indicators?
I'd absolutely echo what Claire has said. Almost everything is going to hang on how well or not well these talks go in the coming weeks. If we were to see statements emerging after the talks indicating that there are prospects for an interim agreement, then certainly that would be a positive indicator for us in terms of de-escalation. However, if we were to see Iran or indeed the United States characterizing one another as being unwilling negotiating partners, as engaging in bad faith, for example, that would indicate that we are more towards a track of escalation. But just as Claire said, I would caution against being overtly fatalistic. It's not guaranteed that we will see military engagement, despite the military buildup that we've seen from the United States over the past few weeks. Another indicator to watch will, of course, be Israel. It's almost certain that we'll see some form of Israeli engagement when it comes to potential US airstrikes targeting Iran, whether that is through intelligence sharing or indeed through direct participation in possibly a more extensive strike campaign. Yesterday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke to the Knesset and said that Iran attacking Israel would be, quote, the greatest mistake in history. And while there's certainly competition for whether or not that would be the greatest mistake in history, it does indicate that what we're seeing is Israel attempting to, at least rhetorically, deter Iran from engaging. Israel wouldn't be doing that if it wasn't concerned about prospects for Iran engaging. And so narratives coming out of Israel, particularly from the Prime Minister's office, as well as narrative coming out of Iran and the United States, will be key to understanding the dynamic here. Something to also watch will be oil prices. Markets are extremely sensitive to concerns regarding the navigability of the Strait of Hormuz, which is a very narrow waterway that Iran has capacity to restrict movement through. Over the past few days, we've often seen oil prices jittering when it comes to prospects for negotiations, for escalation and de-escalation. So if we see oil prices going up very rapidly, that would indicate that at least some energy firms believe that strikes will happen, and Iran will retaliate by restricting the navigability of the waterway. And so that is also a useful indicator for assessing exactly where we are in terms of this seeming roller coaster of regional tensions.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. I look forward to keeping an eye on what your desks are producing. And if something were to go south or go positive in the next couple of days, I will be begging to have you both back on to talk through it. Once again, please, anyone, if you're interested, go check out Megan's Power Players piece on Khamenei to get a better idea of what's going on inside of Iran, the power dynamics there. Until next time, thank you very much.